Hello and welcome to another TLDR video. With the coronavirus shutting down schools, the government and examiners had to get creative when it came to the grading of their students. For our non-UK viewers, every summer students across the UK receive exam results, which shape their futures, from Highers in Scotland to GCSEs and A-levels in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. However, obviously filling a room full of students taking exams wasn't possible this summer, so the examinations didn't take place. But these students still needed grades to get them into sixth forms, colleges and universities. So instead of exams, the government tried to use an algorithm to distribute students' grades. But as we'll explain in this video, it ended up being a bit of a disaster, and they eventually gave up on it altogether. Long story short, it's been a U-turn happy omni-shambles. So in this video, let's take a look at what's happened, and how things snowballed with U-turn after U-turn. If you want to be updated on issues like this as soon as they happen, let me recommend the TLDR Daily Briefing. Weekdays at 5 PM, we release a 4-minute briefing summarising all of the biggest and most interesting news that you might have missed. You can read about it in our daily newsletter or at tldrnews.co.uk. The link to sign up to the newsletter is in the description. Or alternatively, you can listen to the daily podcast by searching for TLDR News in your podcast app of choice. So with exams cancelled, the government and educators had to come up with a new way of assigning grades to students. Essentially, teachers were asked to submit 2 pieces of information about their students, answering in effect 2 questions. Using your professional judgment, what grade would this candidate get in their exam if it were going ahead? And where in that grade band would they be? So in a class of 30, for example, each student would receive a grade. Then for each grade, students would be ranked for each subject. So, for example, for all of the A-star chemistry candidates, teachers would put them in order from the strongest and most likely to get the grade to the weakest. And so on and so forth for all of the remaining grades, and then the same across all other subjects. These grades, the predicted ones by teachers, are known as the Centre Assessed Grades, or CAGs. To mitigate the possibility of grade inflation, or teachers being too lax or too stringent with their grades, all CAGs would go through a process of standardisation, which, by drawing upon past information about a school's performance, would shift up or down the grades that were assigned to each student. Basically, the algorithm looked at the previous 3 years' results for that school. If historically only 10% of students in the school achieved A stars, the algorithm would take only the top 10% of students, as ranked by their teachers, and then give them A stars. This means that if some opportunistic teachers try to award too many students A stars in order to boost their school's rankings, the algorithm would moderate this and give them more realistic results. It is a bit more complicated than that. In fact, the official Ofqual technical document is more than 300 pages long, but that's the gist of how it works. Anyway, sounds like a good idea in principle, right? But in practice, it didn't quite pan out. This system first saw warning signs when results up in Scotland were published, because Scottish results are published earlier than the rest of the UK. Thousands of candidates were downgraded from their teachers' predictions in order to fit the historical model of their school's performance. Now, this in itself isn't the biggest issue. After all, teachers are typically a bit optimistic with their grade predictions. Rather, the issue was the scale of the downgrading, and the way the algorithm disproportionately affected poorer schools. Starting with the scale of the downgrading, the vast majority of students in Scotland were downgraded, and very few were upgraded. The same thing happened in England a week later, when A-level results were published. 35.6% of students had their CAGs downgraded by 1 grade, 3.5% had their CAGs downgraded by 2 grades or more, and just 2.2% saw an increase in grades. Anyway, as we said, this isn't necessarily a problem in itself. Schools obviously have an incentive to inflate their grades, but the downgrades disproportionately affected state schools. The data for Scotland is a bit harder to find, so we're going to stick with A-level data here, but the trends are broadly the same across countries. Independent schools, more commonly known as private schools, saw a way higher increase in A and A stars, the highest A-level grades attainable, when compared to 2019. So how did this happen? How were private school students advantaged if grades were awarded by an algorithm? Well, there's a couple of reasons. Firstly, the algorithm used different rules for different class sizes. For class sizes of 5 or under, the students just got their CAGs. There was no standardization at all. For classes between 5 and 15 people, the CAGs got some weight. So if a school historically only got Cs, but the teacher predicted that the students would get As and A stars, they'd meet somewhere in the middle and they'd get Bs. For classes larger than 15 though, the CAGs had no impact. Yep, even if you were predicted an A star, if your class was larger than 15 and your school historically never got above a C in that subject, you would just get a C. Obviously, normally only private schools can afford to have classes of 15 or even 5 students, and because CAGs are typically higher than the standardized grades, this means that the system substantially advantaged private schools by emphasizing the more favorable CAGs in private schools' smaller classes. Long story short, dumb kids at private schools did well, but smart kids at state school did badly. Now, this could have been remedied if the algorithm had taken into account GCSEs. If the student did well above their school's historic average at their GCSEs, then why couldn't they still get their higher CAG grades? Well, good question. Instead, the algorithm only considered what tenth of the GCSE distribution they were in. So even if you came the absolute top of your school year at GCSE, the algorithm only registered you being in the top 10%. Which limited how much impact it could really have over your grades. Anyway, you get the point, the algorithm was unfair. When results in Scotland came out, pressure began to mount against the SNP government, and particularly Deputy First Minister and Education Secretary John Swinney. Swinney quickly abandoned the moderation aspect of the system and put his full faith in teacher judgment, withdrawing all downgraded results and awarding each and every Scottish candidate their CAG or moderated grade, whichever ended up being higher. So with the rules changed in Scotland, eyes quickly turned to A-level results day on the 13th. The Department for Education, in an attempt to quell any potential fallout, quickly announced a triple lock, giving students a choice. They could either 1. Accept their moderated grade as is, 2. Have a valid mock exam result grade used instead, or 3. Sit an optional exam later in the year, an option that was always available to students. Ofqual announced that they published the guidance as to what counts as a valid mock, and the criteria for them in the following week. Anyway, results day came, and everyone realised that the same thing had happened as in Scotland. The algorithm continued to be unfair, and continued to advantage private schools. Ofqual then published its criteria for a valid mock exam. The exam had to be sat in true exam conditions, cover a substantial part of the specification, and follow the format of the real thing. Again, this sounds pretty good. If your grade was unrealistically low, then you could just show them your mock result and use that instead. But there's a few problems with this. Firstly, some schools don't take mocks as seriously as others, so the mock might not end up counting as valid. Secondly, teachers often raise their grade boundaries in mocks, both to encourage students to work harder and also to accommodate for the fact that mocks only cover part of the syllabus. Thirdly, and most importantly though, if you wanted to use your mock, your school had to appeal on behalf of the whole class. You couldn't just appeal as a single student. With no grade protection in place, this means that if you appealed, other students could see their grades fall, which discouraged schools from appealing. Because of all of this, Ofqual suspended their criteria literally hours later, apparently without even informing the Department for Education. Basically, that was it. You just had to accept your grades. Pressure invariably began to mount, and there were endless stories of talented, high-achieving students at apparently mediocre schools that were being downgraded and losing places at prestigious universities that they'd worked hard for. And there were reports that GCSE results day the following week could end up being even worse. Predictably, the government eventually followed in the Scottish footsteps, and in a statement at 4 p.m. on Monday, it was announced that the entire system and grades would be reverted back to teachers' predictions, and the cap on university places in England would be lifted. This was literally 2 days after the Education Secretary said there would be no U-turn, no change. And that announcement was accompanied by this bizarre photo. Yes, that is a whip on his desk, which comes with a whole variety of conspiracy and alleged symbolism, but we'll leave that for the comments section. As a last note, while this might be a fairer method than the algorithm, it basically just transfers the stress onto universities, who are going to have to figure out a way of either discriminating between students who made their grades, or accommodating for a far larger cohort than ever before. What do you think of this whole situation though? Do you think that the government handled it well, or was there a better way they should have coped with this situation? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release further videos. Also, a special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name listed at the end of the videos just like these people, then be sure to back us on Patreon. There's a link to that in the description.